Let's get started with the first cross-cutting concern, patch management. Patch management on both ACS as well as Service Fabric is more or less the same. This is because the clusters use the exact same infrastructure called Azure Skill Sets. Azure Skill Sets are used to easily scale up and down the nodes in the cluster. With patch management, we need to have a look at three different parts. The first part is the host operating system that is running on the nodes in the cluster. These nodes need to be updated with the latest operating system patches so we keep the underlying host operating system healthy over time. Of course, we want to do this without any downtime of the cluster itself. The second part is that we need to keep the cluster software up to date. For every cluster technology, there's a definitive set of steps that we need to take to make this happen without bringing the cluster down as a whole. The third part is updating the container images. Containers share the kernel of the operating system, so they need to be aligned with the operating system that hosts them. We need to constantly keep the base operating system layers of those images up to date. Of course, the big question now is, how do we make this happen? Let's first start by looking at how we can update the host operating system on a node in the cluster. The process to do so is fairly straightforward, and the procedure itself is the same on all different clusters. The exact commands to execute might differ though. The first step that we need to take is we need to update the nodes. So you first need to ensure that we have enough nodes running in the cluster so that when we take a node out of the cluster, we keep the performance up to date. If you have ensured that we have enough nodes, then you can start draining the traffic to the specific node. You do this by taking the node offline in the cluster. This will drain the traffic that is routed to the running container on that node. Once the traffic is stopped on that node, it's not part of the active cluster anymore, and now you're able to run operating system patches and reboot the machine if necessary. The moment the operating system patch is done, you can then bring the node up again. That makes him online again. After which, the cluster will now schedule the containers to run on these nodes again. The second part of updating the cluster is the cluster management software. The way this is done is dependent on the cluster management software that is used. With Kubernetes and DCOS, for example, we need to go into the cluster manually and reach into the cluster configuration and update it by hand. So this is a little bit more involved than you might think at first. With Service Fabric, we have the option to update the cluster automatically as part of the Service Fabric setup in Azure. If you prefer to manage upgrades yourself, you can also update it by hand by changing the ARM template of the cluster and reapplying the template with an updated version of the cluster software. Finally, we need to manage the container images themselves. Just like any piece of software, images need to be updated regularly. A large part of the container image is the base operating system layer that contains the elements of the operating system not shared in the container host. This layer gets updated frequently. Other layers like the Internet Information Server layer and the ASP.NET layer in the image can also be updated. Your own images are built on top of these layers, and it's up to you to make sure they incorporate those updates. Fortunately, the base operating system layer actually consists out of two separate images. The layer base layer and a smaller update layer. The base layer changes less frequently than the actual update layer. And updating the base OS layer of your image is usually a matter of getting just the latest update layer. This is something that is part of your build process, and you should ensure that you will always fetch the latest images from the public registry. Be careful that you sometimes need to invalidate the image cache on the build machines so you receive the updated layers. This is not done by default and is something you need to cater for in your build strategy. Let me show you in the next demo how the operating system layers and the update layers work in a Windows Server Core operating system.